Okay, Ryan said disjointed pathways. We'll discuss that here in a minute. Okay, funding, always funding is definitely a problem. Existing infrastructure, physical capabilities, age, financial status, these are all barriers to accessible transportation. Pre-existing structures, roads and easements, okay. Pathways falling into disrepair on the interstates. Let's talk about disjointed pathways. Particularly, what pathways are the most disjointed as far as what modes, and how do we solve that issue? Ryan, I think that was yours. Did you have?
Yeah, I think you could think about it from a macro and a micro level. So someone down, Isaac mentioned kind of something similar on a macro scale. Interstates and major state highways are a barrier because they're not pedestrian accessible by nature. But then I think even neighborhood scale, if there's no Dave Roberts, who's not on this call, but he loves to show that picture of the bus stop that's got like an incline and this grass, people walk up the grass path, and I just think of that in my head all the time, like that's not encouraging anyone to utilize, and you can't if you're in a wheelchair or a bicycle or whatever. So I just think we have placed the nodes of connection where there are no vital ways to get from home to the converging point.
So what would be a solution to that?
I mean, I would suggest that if that is not a canned answer, but if cities bought into the engagement strategy and worked with MetroPlan and others to begin funding, studies to create pathway systems that were kind of holistic, it would help them understand where they need to make the investment. I'm going to start with sidewalks at the neighborhood scale, and it's like, well, why do we build that sidewalk that doesn't get anybody anywhere? Why don't we build one that is basically all encompassing? I mean, this is very simplistic too, so I'm not saying this is easy, but my point is there's funding opportunities and grant opportunities, 2 or 3 different opportunities that cities can use to do this, and to build out that plan with a little collaboration here with the team would be a great place to start.
Okay, so I would take from that to maybe fund more studies for active transportation connectivity. So we are utilizing our funds as best we could.
I would agree, and just remind municipalities and neighborhoods that these funds are even available, right? I mean, I just think well, there's a problem, I don't know how to fix it. And studies would need to focus on data points. How can we reach the most people with the easiest solution? What's the most inclusive solution?
Okay. Anybody else have any thoughts on how we might be able to kind of bridge the gap on those disjointed facilities? No? Okay. So funding at a local level, this is always a major question, and I'm still trying to pick everybody's brain to see what we could do about that. What are some ways that we can think about funding, or maybe reallocating certain funding? Anybody have any ideas on that one?
Daniel, I think that, from a funding at a local level, trying to convince, from a municipal standpoint, trying to convince your city council that this is a good thing to allocate funds for, that it will work, trying to, I guess, change the paradigm and make them think about not just vehicular centric, but, trying to move them to a different place. I think that's especially from where I sit, that's the biggest lift, I think, and anyone can agree or disagree with that.
No,
that's
I
a-
agree, Brad. I'm sorry, Daniel. I mean, I
Go
just
ahead. No.
I enthusiastically endorse that. There's a mental barrier that we have where we just treat our pedestrians and anyone not in a car as a second class citizen. That's happening, and to the point where it is invasive in the mindset of city councils and other governing bodies, street departments, whomever. That is everywhere. So they're like, why would I do that when we have crumbling streets? It's like, well, you're not thinking about the right priorities here. This is not a people-centric plan that you've got.
So that might be a messaging problem. So how do we get the message out to our decision-making body on maybe a rethinking of the way we think about transportation? Are there any suggestions on that? I see Walter turning some gears there. Anybody else? It's always hard to reach out to the public. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think just connecting, redesigning some of these like maybe downtown spaces and investing in sidewalks and just showing how that can contribute to economic development. I think is a really great argument for especially city leaders. In Russellville, they redesigned the downtown. That's where I'm from. No, it's not in the Metro Plan area, but they redesigned the downtown and it got really bad reviews in the moment. But 10 years later, there's a really vibrant downtown space and people love it. So, I think just pointing to those successes and how it can contribute to economic development is key for that messaging.
I think that's a great idea. I think proof of concept is very important when we're showing, hey, this works. Anybody else have any thoughts on that?
Daniel, I think you have to have users state this, not staff, not Metro Plan, not the staffs of the different agencies. So you need, and not necessarily somebody that can be pointed to as an interest group. So not somebody that's coming up and saying, I'm representing AARP, but somebody who is elderly that says that they need the sidewalks to get around. And maybe that's them talking to directly to their elected officials or school children or something like that. If it's coming from Metro Plan or it's coming from staff, you're going to have deaf ears. So it's got to be coming from the users, and not when it can be pointed to that. Well, they're just an advocacy group. I can't talk this morning. So it needs to not be somebody who's coming up, like I said, not somebody who's coming up and saying, well, I represent AARP, and so you need to be doing this for elderly. It need to be actual constituents.
That's a good point. I think finding those people and getting the message out to them and receiving that would help. And maybe that's where a strategy would come into play. How do we see those common man advocates? How do we find those people and how do we make their voice heard?
Daniel, I think one way to do what you're talking about is that each of us on the call, we're in some capacity as an advocate or an expert in one form or another. We need to advocate for those people and bring them to the table and give them a microphone. But I think all of us can facilitate those connections.
Definitely.
I have thought about that, Daniel. Completely agree with Walter and Biles and Ryan's thoughts. An idea I had, because Julie and I've been working on, surveys for the Trails project and thinking for the first time really hard about what does a good survey look like and all that stuff. And something that I thought about was like, if we need to, and we do need to bring, the people who are walking the paths that we're thinking about reconstructing. If it's sidewalks, it applies to anything, bus stops, using some kind of place-based research or data collection. And it can be as simple as like, we're thinking about putting a bus stop here. We're thinking about like putting a sidewalk here, encouraging that kind of creative data collection, because people, you have to be able to get a snapshot in the moment of what people are thinking when they're out on those facilities. And instead of like bringing them to a city council meeting or what have you is the best option because you get to have a conversation. But if you get to capture in the moment their thoughts about, you know, whatever project is proposed, that would be invaluable for any planning department, street department, or public works. So it's just a thought I had.
Definitely, it's important to go to people where they are, and I think especially if you have users of a system, they'll be able to tell you, you know, it would really help if we had this or that. Let's see if anybody has any final thoughts on that. Let's go ahead and get them out, but I'm going to try to get to some of these other ones. Let's see, pathways falling into disrepair. Isaac, that's something you brought up. Interstates, major highways. So that's a maintenance issue, and that's certainly something that we've talked about in other discussions. See, pre-existing structures, road easements. Clara, do you have any additional thoughts on that? Where that might be a barrier and some solutions?
No, I don't know how solution-based I am, but it is definitely a problem. I mean, if you've got a narrow 2-lane road and we're trying to create a bike path or now add sidewalks or redefine it for how we want to move forward, that's a problem. And that's a big barrier.
All right. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? I know John, I think you're on the call. John probably deals with this a lot in his work. If he's muted. So
you mean trying to implement new infrastructure into a road that doesn't have any of that existing? Like she was talking about a narrow 2-lane road that has no curb gutter, drainage, anything like that, and you want to implement some kind of bike lane, side path, sidewalk, even sidewalks. I mean, typically the way that we've had to approach those from Little Rock's perspective is you're either going to rebuild the street to create a space to actually have that infrastructure, which obviously increases costs tremendously. But typically when you have streets of that nature, you have no right of way, utility conflict. There's so much more that goes into it to actually create that infrastructure. It's not as simple as going out and just putting in even a sidewalk. A lot of the things that we've run into, getting back to the whole, like what Walter talked about, was getting users and people that are not necessarily using infrastructure now, but people that aren't using it but want to have something to use. I think is important to have come and talk to your boards and leaders about wanting that infrastructure, not people that are using it currently, but people that want it so they can use it later. Because we run into a lot of instances where we're building new sidewalks in neighborhoods, and it's always, we want sidewalks, but when you go out to build the sidewalks, oh, don't put that in front of my house, put it across the street in front of my neighbor's house. So even though there's a demand for this infrastructure, there's always going to be pushback from the public that want it, but they don't want it in front of their house. So there's a lot, when you get into the details of doing these projects, it can become difficult and sometimes lead to people not wanting that infrastructure in the future because of how it impacts their property. That's just some of the things we run into in doing some of this infrastructure across the city.
Yeah, and certainly, I think maybe one way to address that, obviously, we need to first find who the users are that want to use a system that we can't identify easily. So that's one issue. And then maybe providing alternatives to like maybe off that facility. Those might be some strategies around, you know, if you can't do it on that facility, where's the next closest one? So those might be some strategies. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that one? That one's difficult when you have limitations. Okay, well, let's tackle kind of the maintenance issue, the pathways falling into disrepair. Um, what are some strategies, or is there some sort of way to implement a program that prioritizes something? Does anybody have any thoughts there? I think one thing that we do agree on is that we need to focus more of our efforts on maintenance. I think that that's been brought up in other discussions as well. Okay.
I was going to say something. We keep coming around to collecting data from people on infrastructure, on what their needs are. Well, maybe with technology being what it is and the ability to collect everyone's data so quickly now, there needs to be some type of, I don't want to say an app, I don't want to go that far, but some way for people to quickly, while they're on a road, while they're walking, while they're cycling, that they can capture some of these problems and share them with maybe a clearinghouse that can move that information into the right areas to correct crumbling path infrastructure or suggest new solutions to helping our needs.
Chris, I like that idea a lot. Is that something Metro Plan could help facilitate? Like subscribe to a clearinghouse or be the clearinghouse?
That's an interesting concept. That's not something that we want to commit to right now, but something that certainly certainly would be interesting to look into.
No, I need you to commit, Daniel. Come on. Let's.
Rock Region has their app that's real-time data. So I think developing an app that's way out of my realm. So I actually like that idea though. I think real-time data, whenever you have a user that's like, well, this little sidewalk piece for 5 feet is really crumbly and I can't walk down it very easily. I think that would be very valuable. And that might actually come up in the technology discussion for theme 4. Somebody gonna say something?
Yeah, this is John again. Excuse me. We have, Little Rock has, and I don't know, maybe some of the other cities have it as well, our 311 system, where if people see issues, they can either use our 311 app, they can dial 311, they can go online on their computer to our webpage and input requests for services. Now, when it comes to, the example you gave, a crumbled panel of sidewalk, that is not something that we're going to be able to address immediately. If it's a pothole, if there's other things, if it's debris on the path or on the sidewalk, stuff that can be easily done through a maintenance issue, that's the kind of stuff that we can address quickly. Rebuilding, repairing sidewalks, we have, that's a really long list of requests already. So we're working on requests that we got from 4 or 5 years ago right now. But so that technology does exist, and we have a system implemented for that. So tracking it and getting it in a system and being able to identify where these locations are is a good part about that. Our ability to respond necessarily is dependent on some of the other things you've been talking about, the funding and et cetera, to try to do these bigger, more expensive repairs and installations. Just wanted to let everybody know that we do have a 311 though.
That's good to know, because I actually did not know that. So that's one way. Chris, if you want to develop an app, you could probably make a lot of money on that. But yeah, that's definitely something that data collection, certainly in this age, real-time data would be real helpful. Maybe, as John said, we can't get to things real quickly, but if it's a kind of a inspirational app, the way it's framed, that might help with some decision making. Let me go through a few of these. I do want to make sure we get a little bit into theme 3. We had a longer discussion yesterday on that one. So we've got negative public perception of public transportation. That's certainly a big issue. That's also a messaging thing. How do we message to people? What would be a strategy to message to people to show the benefits of transit?
Daniel, one of the other things, which is not answering the question you just asked, but actually the biggest negative transit thing that I've ever heard people say is the buses are empty, so why do we need to put more money in buses? So I agree that there is the issue that it's for them issue, transit, and then that's part of the hurdle. But as long as there's a visual optical thing of a large bus with nobody in it for a lot of the day, then you're going to continually have people say, well, we need to fix this road. We don't need to put more money in buses because look, their buses are empty or they're almost empty. So somehow we have to find a way to change the optics also.
Yeah, it's certainly certainly something that you see, and then people wonder, well, nobody uses it, so why? But people do use it, and we gotta illustrate that somehow to the public, and in that it is a public good. Maybe that's cardboard cutouts. They did that with the NCAA games. But does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Well, it sounds like it could at least partially involve a marketing push, and I think the marketing push today looks different than it did a year ago. Or so this is kind of cool. We had an EV parade come from North Little Rock to Lone Oak on Saturday, dedicated our downtown EV chargers, and so 21 Teslas are rolling down Highway 70, which is an awesome sight. And I got to drive one, so I hadn't driven a Tesla before. And I'm thinking here, you know, EV and autonomous is the next thing, but we can't all, in our community, everybody can't afford to pay $60,000 for a used new one of these, right? So what if we played up the, hey, you don't have to drive, you know, a bus is essentially you riding around in an autonomous vehicle with Wi-Fi, getting things done, you know, because now we're all envisioning, what if I didn't have to hold my hand on the steering wheel? What could I get done? It's like the bus already does that for you. You know, the future's already here in the bus. Wi-Fi is already here. Make it free, make it safe, you know, and play up to this aspect of people being more productive with their time, which I think we're all pretty sensitive to at this point. You know, these are positive things that are already there. We're just perhaps not talking about. And Rock Region might be talking about that, and I might have missed it, but you know, let's talk about things people are looking for that we're already doing with transit.
So maybe it's identifying those things that people are looking for in their daily commutes first, and then making sure that we're addressing those issues in our marketing of transit. I think that's a good idea. Anybody else on that one? Okay. Walter, you said sidewalks and bikeways being a barrier to accessible transportation?
No, I added that in when we were having a discussion about disjointed.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, sometimes you know, I don't get them in real time. So, okay, so sidewalks and buses, bikeways are obviously a solution to some of the accessible transportation issues. 311 is helpful. Go ahead. Am I hearing somebody, or is that just kind of feedback? Okay, assume that's feedback. And then there is the comment of NIMBYism, which is certainly a barrier. I think, again, we've talked a lot about messaging. It's just messaging and showing the benefits of these different things that people aren't used to. So I think we've done a lot of good work on that. Does anybody have any final thoughts on barriers to accessible transportation before we move on? All right. Let's move to theme 3, which is reliable, resilient, and safer transportation and environments. The transportation system should be designed and maintained to address infrastructure condition, congestion, safety, and environmental impacts. The transportation system should support the needs of a region with varying urban, suburban, and rural populations and landscapes. So again, we're going to use the chat. I want us to discuss specific ways that we can mitigate the transportation system's negative impacts on a few items. In last meeting, we only got to the first two, and I think that's probably where we're gonna stay today. So what are some ways that we can mitigate our transportation's effects on pedestrians and bicycle safety? Does anybody ride a bike and see some areas that need improvement as far as how bikes or being a pedestrian, you interact with all the other modes?
I started riding my bike to work this past month, and because I felt like I was kind of a poser on all these meetings, and all these cool people are riding bikes. So since I only live 3/4 of a mile from my studio, and it's like having a baby in a stroller or being in a wheelchair. It's you see the world from a completely different perspective when you've got two small wheels traversing all of this terrain and these interfaces with interactions with other modes of transportation. And it's just like no one sees you. You are unseen. They don't expect to see you. There's no expectation that they're going to have to interact with you. So when they do, it's a surprise, and then they don't know what to do. And so I'm learning that too. I'm learning, what is the courtesy, what's safe. So Clara is making a comment here in the chat, build the bike system at initial construction time. I love that, because it's like, this was always a part of it. It's not an afterthought. Cyclists are not, again, I'll use the term second-class citizens. We're all here. I'm using bike as a transportation form in addition to recreation, but to get back and forth to work, you should expect to see someone not in a vehicle trying to get to their place of business. If we build it with the original infrastructure, it's like an expectation. It's the same thing as preparing for a guest. It's like we knew you were coming, so we made this for you, and we're glad you're here.
Yeah, I like that idea, Clara. Definitely, we do that with sidewalks, and certainly bike infrastructure is something that we don't think about when we're developing a project for transportation. Some of those things are in subdivision regulations already as far as the sidewalks. So maybe bikes could also be something. Does anybody have any other thoughts on that particular thing? Pedestrian safety.
I'll say something about building it while you're building something new. Sidewalks, obviously, like you said, are incorporated, at least for Little Rock. Those are incorporated as part of our design requirements. And so are other modes of transportation. They are required to be done as part of new construction. The big, what's the word I'm looking for? Factor in all of that is you have to have a plan in place that identifies where you're going to be doing that type of infrastructure. We have had a bike master plan for probably decades. Walter might know exactly off the top of his head how long we've had that. But the problem with our existing bike master plan is it identifies bike infrastructure in areas where it's going to be extremely difficult to ever incorporate that those either bike lanes, separated paths into the existing fabric of those neighborhoods or areas where the roads exist. So what we are currently in the process of doing is working with a consultant to actually go back and redo our entire bike master plan to identify corridors that, number one, connect us across the city for both recreational and commuter type users. So we'll have a plan that we know we can implement when we do reconstruct a road, or someone is building a new extension, a new subdivision, a new commercial development. We know that this is a corridor that we want this infrastructure in place. And what we're up against right now is we have some areas identified where if you tried to put in, let's say you wanted to put bike lanes on the side of a road. Well, it's in a neighborhood where no one has off-street parking available. So now if you put in bike lanes, either you have to widen the road to accommodate both on-street parking and bike infrastructure lanes. So number one, you're rebuilding the entire road. You're impacting the property of these residents. That's the kind of stuff we're trying to get away from with a good plan that identifies corridors that we can have this infrastructure without impacting the ability to actually implement it in the future. And that's really important to everyone to think about, especially in some of the smaller areas that are in Metro Plan that are starting to grow. You need to have these plans thought through and put in place early, so you're not like us where you've already got a tremendous amount of area that you're trying to go back and retrofit stuff into that is very difficult to do once you're trying to start down that path. And I'll stop talking at that point.
I think those are a bunch of good points. Having a plan in place, if you're going to put the requirements for the bike infrastructure to be in on the first of the project, you need to make sure there's a plan in place that's going to connect and it's going to be useful to ensure that's better at the implementation phase. Is there any thoughts on what John just said, or basically the theme of making bike infrastructure a part of initial project planning?
I think from a design standpoint, let's make it easier for cities to make this choice. It's like, well, what type of path is it? I mean, why can a cyclist ride on a sidewalk? Well, not really. Well, then what kind of path? Do we need to build a sidewalk and a bike path? Or, what is the true definition of a shared use path? So I think there's a terminology and a design option kind of barrier for communities that may not have. And again, I apologize because I'm always coming at it from a small community perspective, and
that's what we
a
want.
lot of our larger communities have someone who has this knowledge, and we do too. We actually have the head of our community development department has an architecture background, which is really awesome because I can talk with them about these issues. But for the most part, it's like, which type of path do we use? What options are there? Is there a kind of easy out of the box way where we can make it? It's like, hey, this is the type of thing that you need depending on your situation. This is a solution you need on your situation. Here's an average cost per lineal foot for the purposes of building out, ballpark budgets to consider, and just helping cities come to these conclusions instead of leaving them to their own devices as to say, is it a good idea or a bad idea? It's like, I don't even know what the solution should be,
So maybe coming up with something that maybe Metro Plan could help out with is coming up with kind of a information packet, of how to facilitate these, from everything from the discussions to the public to how to budget. Maybe that's something we could look into.
Just a playbook, right? Just a series of basic building blocks, and I'm not talking pages. I'm talking 4 or 5 at maximum. And this might be a good place to kudos to Lakeisha, because the new publication is awesome. I passed it along to our planning commission members and others because it's like, this is a great primer. Y'all need to be aware, of what's going on with Metro Plan, and it's just a great. It addresses paths in the most recent one, well, it addresses a lot of things, but I was like, this is good. Everybody needs to be reading this. So y'all already have something in place where that could potentially be housed.
We appreciate that. Yeah, we certainly plan on continuing those best practice publications.
And Daniel,
go ahead.
This is John again, and you may want to mention that Metro Plan is currently working on is it a development guideline? It's almost like a master street plan guideline for some of the smaller communities that some of this suggestion could almost even be incorporated into that. That's being done by y'all right now. And then, there's also going to start looking at some of the master trail plan, the regional trail planning. And that might be something we want to look at with that group eventually, maybe coming up with with not requirements, but suggestions for what a typical trail section or shared use path section could be for the entire region to sort of use, at least as a guideline, so we have some continuity across the whole region.
Definitely. We have a few things going right now. The model codes, which are kind of dealing more with zoning and subdivision regulations, our multimodal guidelines, which probably is what you're talking about, which kind of gives a set of standards that would be best practice for connecting the multiple modes and how you construct certain pathways on certain corridors. And then we also have just kicked off the multi-use paths trail plan that will be done probably sometime next year to guide regional investment in trails. So those are things that we are doing, and that certainly is something that we need to push out to these small cities and make sure that everybody knows that this is happening and we do have some set standards. I do want to, there's a comment about San Juan has bright green special lane just for bikes. That's a good overarching way to put an emphasis on safety, since this is a safety issue. You have a defined path for bikes. Are there any other ways from maybe a markings standpoint that we can make things safer for bikes and pedestrians, from just simple painting to other things? Any technologies or anything that makes it more apparent that, hey, this is a space for other modes?
I think you could have some low impact landscaping that forms visual indicators. That's not something that's expensive to replace if impacted or destroyed, right? So, I mean, what if you had an 8-inch or a foot strip between a roadway? I'm thinking a lot of our roads don't have curbs. We have surface drainage. So what if you had an 8-inch strip or a 12-inch strip that you just planted wildflowers between the roadway and the bike path or the sidewalk? It's a bright line that's organic and very simple and easy to install and potentially easy to maintain.
Yeah, I think any kind of like physical barrier like that would be helpful, not only to see the pedestrians, but it might also encourage bikers and pedestrians to actually use bike lanes. Because I know that when I ride my bike or run, I spend most of my time dodging cars, even though there are lanes for me to bike and run in. So I think just that would also encourage that use, and then kind of spiral into more people being aware that there are bikers and runners on those streets.
Definitely. Anybody else have any like specific things that they've seen in their travels or around Arkansas that help delineate between, maybe a one mode or another? Maybe even between pedestrians and bicycles, because sometimes those can come into conflict.
Daniel, you need to have something in here that allows mix too. The part of the problem is we're trying to segregate everything, and the road systems were never designed to segregate everything. And technically, bicycles are vehicles, and they're supposed to be on the road, and cars are supposed to respect them as another vehicle on the road. So if we now gone to the point to say bicycles aren't on the road, they need a separate infrastructure, then no city that's developed is going to be able to put in a complete system, because that's too much stuff, like John just said. So part of the problem is that the change in thinking. The original thinking was bicycles ought to be in the road, and they're just another vehicle. And so because of safety and other issues, now we've said that class 3s, which is bicycles in a road, are not what we ought to do. If you go back and look at what John's statement about the Little Rock's bike plan, at different points, class 3s were the primary route because bicycles were supposed to be on the road, supposed to share it. And so the thought process has changed more recently that they need to be segregated. And so you can't make that. That's a huge leap from a development of the system standpoint, that they have to be a separate facility. And I don't think they do always have to be a separate facility. problem goes back to the thing that I've raised many, many times, which is a connectivity issue, because we're putting too many cars on the arterials. No other roads connect except arterials. So where the bicycles and pedestrians have to go if they're going anyplace, the arterials, which is where all the fast moving cars are. If we had connectivity, it wouldn't be as big an issue.
And something that you kind of might be alluding to here, shared street concepts. So not always separating. Obviously, there's plenty appropriate places for that, but maybe there are some places where you combine them together on a shared street and use different methods to make everybody work together. That's kind of partly what I'm hearing here.
Yeah, you've got to find a way to design the road to help encourage the cars and trucks to slow down. Otherwise, it's not going to work. The bicyclists are going to be scared off unless they're really, really, really brave. There are a few of those in Little Rock that are maybe crazy brave that they get on some of the roads. But we can slow down the vehicles, then you can allow that interaction in between the two. But if you can't slow them down, then you go totally back to the safety issue, and the reaction to that is segregate. So the reaction to everybody isn't to slow down the cars, by the way. Everybody's talking about segregating the bicycles. So why are we not talking about slowing down the vehicles?
Definitely.
Well, and Daniel, I wanted to agree with Walter on this. The way that development is occurring currently, at least in the city of Little Rock, there is no connectivity between residential subdivision, commercial development. It's all, I want my own individual access to my area, and there's no cross connectivity between even your smaller residential subdivisions. Even your big residential subdivisions have no connectivity the way a long time ago everything's grid system, and now it's more of a cul-de-sac loop lane. And I want to emphasize to some of these other regions within MetroPlan that are just now starting to see this growth and expansion, you need to think about that in your codes and your requirements for your development. And even if they don't physically connect with the street, having some kind of connectivity for bicycle and pedestrian where those individuals don't have to get out on those major roads to get where they're wanting to go is so important. It's something that we're struggling with greatly now because of the way development has occurred. And it's a political decision, let's be honest. I mean, staff are not the ones that make this determination in the long run. So getting out there and letting your leaders, your boards, your mayors, the people that are making these decisions on the policy level, know how important this is as your cities grow for your future, not today, but we're talking 10, 15, 20 years down the road, is really important to have those kind of rules and policies put in place so you can have this connectivity in the future. And you're not trying to go back and retrofit everything back into an arterial corridor like Cantrell out there at 430 and Rodney Parham that the highway department's building right now. I mean, there's no way that's going to be pedestrian bicycle friendly. It's impossible to do something in that corridor at this point.
Right.
So
definitely a good point. Connectivity is key. So you avoid pedestrians and bicycles having to ever get on a major road to create that conflict in the first place. Let's move on to automobile safety. So we've talked a lot about pedestrians and bikes. We do also have to consider automobiles have other safety concerns as well that can be coming into conflict with pedestrians and bikes or coming into conflict with other automobiles. What are some ways to increase that? We've got about 7 minutes left. We will continue this in the next meeting, and there will probably be some more topics. But automobile safety, does anybody have any ways to address this?
We need better drivers.
Better drivers. That came up in last meeting.
I mean, I'm pretty sure the cars are safe for those who are driving them. It's other factors that affect drivers. capabilities in the moment. And I think we all know what those are.
Are there any ways from a when we're developing projects and we're developing facilities, are there any ways to make those better?
I think you got to reduce the speeds. You really have to reduce the speeds. We got to stop designing roads to move maximum movement of vehicles at the fastest speed possible. Right turns on red, that's a disaster for pedestrians and bicyclists too, really. So all the things that we've done to try to improve the moving of vehicles have been bad for everything else. Now, the one thing that I will give kudos to Little Rock on is the changing our downtown signal so that it's red in all directions for a short period of time till pedestrians get across the intersections in downtown Little Rock. There has to be more thinking like that. And so, but everything we've done for decades has been to try to improve the number of vehicles that we can move through a space in as short a period of time as possible. We've used lots of reasons for that, including pollution. We want to reduce pollution by not having cars idle as long. We use everything we can think of to try to give as a justification to move vehicles faster.
So when we're thinking about moving of vehicles, that's essentially what we have done in planning. But certainly, I think we need to recognize there are particular places where that might be appropriate. Maybe it's prioritizing corridors where you are trying to move cars, and focusing on making sure that the other corridors are more of multimodal transportation that makes it safer for everybody. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? That reducing the speed of cars, are there particular ways to do that?
I would say, Daniel, incorporating more speed tables. And I know that speed tables are kind of preferred in certain specific areas and land uses like downtowns, but they are effective as like a, as an attention grabber for drivers. They see a different color and different material and slow down. So Conway's added them in their roundabout construction, and it looks really good, and it does work because it kind of brings your car to a different pavement, and it feels different when you're driving over it, and you always see it. So, and
Yeah,
that could
I
be
agree with that.
encouraged for like even large scale developments. Like, I don't know off the top of my head if they're at the promenade, but it could be encouraged and or required in some.
Pleasant Ridge has them. Pleasant Ridge has a pretty nice landscape, and they do have the speed tables as well at the crossings.
Yeah.
To use a shopping center as an example. But Isaac's exactly right. It's a design solution. There's a design solution somewhere in there to give those visual cues.
Certainly at conflict points, raised crosswalks. I know we're kind of going back to pedestrians there, but raised intersections, those are some things that are going to pop up in our accessibility guidelines. And so those are considerations as well. Any last thoughts on automobile safety? We'll probably come back to this in the next meeting, since we didn't get a whole lot of time with it. When we're talking about maybe a freeway facility, are there different principles we have limited say here, but are there things that we need to maybe consider and bring up that might help automobiles have a safer commute? Certainly can't do speed tables or bumps on freeway, but
Daniel, I think from a freeway standpoint, it's more that ramps, the access ramps on and off the freeways. And in Little Rock, North Little Rock, it's really, which supposedly the 30 project is going to take some care of, is the weave that the ramps cause that you have to go through. So the interchange, the 430, 630 interchange helps some of that. when that was put in. So it's a safer interchange now from a freeway standpoint than I think it was before the reconstruction of that. And my recollection of what the proposals were in the 30 project, assuming they do all of it, because it's what, $1 trillion or something like that, to do all of it, it would be a safer freeway all the way from the mall in North Little Rock all the way through downtown Little Rock. It would be a safer freeway for the people on this freeway if they do all those things.
Certainly. Access in general, I mean, that could be on any corridor. Access management was brought up in last meeting. Well-planned, well-designed access, certainly on freeways and arterials. We're pretty much wrapping up here. It's 10:59. Does anybody have any final thoughts before we throw in the towel? Nope. Getting a thumbs up. All right. Well, I appreciate y'all coming today, and this discussion was great, and so was the last session. So we'll have some notes for you, and when we get them compiled, there was quite a bit of them on my end. We do plan on meeting sometime in May. We'll hopefully schedule that in the next week or so. Look towards the end of May. I will send a doodle poll out and make sure that everybody's good with that. We'll probably still in May. I plan on doing that meeting online. And then June, I think let's try to get together in person. Well, obviously we'll see the conditions in June, where we feel comfortable. But I'd like to get together in person and maybe have a meal. So thanks everybody. And I look forward to our next meeting. We'll let you know about it. Have a good one.
Thanks.
If we need to follow up, we can just do it in person. So I'll close down.